And we're live. Hey, everybody. We are excited to be have joined with us a whiskey maker from Three Chord. And of course, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Nick. I'm one of the co-founders of Breaking Bourbon, breakingbourbon.com. One of my partners here tonight, Eric. Eric, how you doing?
I'm doing good.
And Jordan, unfortunately, could not make this blending sesh. But I'm sure he'll be on for the next one. And then later on, we should have Blake from Seelbach joining in as well. So he's going to come in. He's going to taste how awesome the blends are that we've made so far, and then add his layer of opinion onto it. So looking forward to that. So without further ado, let me introduce Ari Sussman of Three Chord. So Ari, if you could just tell us a little bit about who you are, a little bit about Three Chord, and then kind of what we're going to be doing here tonight.
Happily. So thank you so much for having myself and having Three Chord on your show. It means a lot. We love your show. So Three Chord is a 5-year-old company that's been in the market for about just over 3 years, founded about 5 years ago, and founded very intentionally by Neil Giraldo, who had success in the music industry, both behind the scenes, but also in front of the camera. We can talk about that a little bit. It's a passionate, creative force, Neil Giraldo, and he had the idea of starting a whiskey company. And when he looked at the different models that were available for starting a whiskey company, you can start a distillery, you can be a rectifier, you can simply bottle whiskey that you get from various distilleries, slap a label on it, put it out. He wasn't necessarily interested in any of those models, and the whiskey making technique and tradition that I think once he started scratching the surface and getting into it, that he felt connected to, was the art of blending. If folks come to American whiskey, say from maybe you started appreciating whiskey with Scotch, and you're going to be very familiar with blended Scotch whiskeys, the processes that go behind it. Same with cognac, right? If you come to whiskey or to American whiskey with an appreciation of brandy, you're going to have some knowledge of cognac and how the cognac labels that we see at the store, those are big blending houses. Those aren't necessarily actual distillers. So there's some major differences between, let's say, American, where the American whiskey scene is right now in terms of supply, and more old world techniques of collaborating with distilleries, of sourcing and of blending and of changing products to make them better. So Three Chord was founded very intentionally as a blending house, where the idea is we would find really remarkable barrels of whiskey or groups, lots of barrels of whiskey. And we would create different whiskey expressions based on what we wanted to create. If we wanted an introductory expression, we would do that. Slightly lower proof, more approachable. We have whiskeys that are blends of that are Kentucky straight bourbons finished in wine casks, right? We do a lot of experimentation with barrel finishing. And one of the things that we're most excited about that we're going to be doing tonight is we love taking barrels, inputs that would otherwise be single barrels, that are single barrel quality. They stand on their own, these barrels. But one thing that we love to do is bring out the graduated cylinder and see if we can't create a whiskey using high quality whiskeys as inputs, create a blend. And that's sort of, in a sense, where Three Chord has differentiated itself, and we've had a lot of fun and some success crafting unique blends of American whiskeys.
And Ari, correct me if I'm wrong. Do you have some history in wine making as well?
Yeah. So I do come from. I was originally a winemaker. I trained a little bit in Europe and France, in southwestern France. That's where I learned about fermentation. That's where I learned about agriculture. It's also where I learned about distillation. So I did my first distillations in France in my early 20s when I thought I wanted to be a winemaker. When I came back to the United States after spending a couple summers in France making wine, I got a job with a hospitality group. And I started getting very interested in cocktails and the spirits behind cocktails. And you're a sort of geeky bartender and you're reading a lot of the old cocktail books, you'll find that some of those spirits that were the centerpieces of cocktails pre-prohibition, some of those whiskeys or brandies or liqueurs, no longer exist, right? And you're perpetually on the search for flavor. And for me, I started as a bartender. I started as a whiskey maker. Then when I became a bartender, I became interested in these old cocktail recipes. When the spirits didn't exist, I thought I'd love to bring some of these old spirits that nobody's seen for 100 years back on the shelves, let bartenders play with them, and maybe even work with agricultural producers, farmers, in sourcing, finding, or breeding, the inputs that would then go into these spirits. And that sort of mentality has been a really interesting. It's taken us in a lot of places, and at Three Chord, when it comes to blending, it has a little bit more to do. I feel like I'm putting on my bartender hat in my sort of the mixologist thing. That's a little bit more like whiskey blending. Whiskey blending is more like that than it is like fermentation and distillation. So the skill set in blending is a different skill set than the skill set in grain selection, mashing, fermentation, and distillation. So it's fun.
Oh yeah. And I mean, from a blending perspective too, before we get started, I mean, I always feel like, frankly, so far when I blend it, it's continually change it until you find something you really like and change and tweak it. I mean, what would you layer onto that as we get started tonight? What would you layer onto that idea of just finding what you like the best? What other tips would you give from a blending perspective and things we should be thinking about as we go forward?
So great question. And essentially, there's no right or wrong way to blend. There's no standard protocol that everyone must follow. That being said, there are techniques that have been developed over hundreds of years in whiskey making regions that have blending traditions that we at Three Chord are able to draw from. And I'm happy to jump into it whenever you like. But one of the things that when we are off to make a blend, I like to pour out samples of at least whiskeys from each of the lots that we're choosing to blend, right? So if you have 3 whiskeys in front of you, get to know each of those whiskeys, get to know their aroma, get to know their viscosity, their mouthfeel, their flavor, where it hits every place in the body, in the mouth. And we'll do this for each of these spirits. Get to know each of the spirits and as you're getting to know them, intuitively try to figure out, okay, what feels like it should be the centerpiece of the picture, and what plays a supportive role, if that makes sense. So as we taste these whiskeys, we're going to think about what we like about the aroma and the mouthfeel and the flavors, and from that we're going to kind of like start to conceptualize what a whiskey blend might taste like.
Yeah, so I know, Eric, I think you cracked yours, started getting them poured. What do we got here?
Let's go over what we have so everybody kind of knows what we're working with here. So we have 3 different whiskeys that are from different states. They all have different mash bills, proofs, and ages. So we have a ton of different stuff we're working with here in this blend.
That's right. And let's, in the sense of, in the interest of keeping them straight, I think we have 3 different whiskeys here, and let's call them one. We can either call them 1, 2, or 3, or I'm happy to call them out by the name and where they're from and everything, whatever is easier for you.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to know where they're from. I mean, so I'm looking at an Indiana bourbon, 118.1 proof,
That's
4.5 years old. It's a 60-36-4 mash bill, 60% corn, 36 rye, 4% malted barley.
So there's your classic Indiana high rye mash bill, which are showing incredibly well right now. So this one was distilled in February of 2017, and if you taste barrels regularly, you know that they cycle through peaks and troughs, and sometimes they improve, and sometimes you need to put them away for a little bit more. These we selected these barrels, and this one in particular, because I think it's showing really well right now. That doesn't necessarily mean that a year from now, it's going to be as cohesive as it is right now. It could kind of fall apart and then come back together and fall apart and come together.
So before we talk about the
118, 36% rye. Let's call that number one.
Yep.
I'd say before we move on, maybe give that one a taste. And this is the first time I've tried these. I have not.
Yeah, me too.
Open these bottles yet.
That's got a really nice expressive nose too.
Yeah. So it's jumping out of the glass a little bit in terms of the aroma. I'm going to write that down because as we make the blend, the first impression is always important. And if your first impression is, okay, this is leaping, sort of leaping out of the glass with aromatics, let's keep in mind that might make an interesting, what we'd call a top note. That might make an interesting aromatic component later on. So it's worth just noting in our mind. And I always write things down when I taste. So I'm writing this down.
Doing the same.
Good. So yeah, the top note there is definitely prominent.
And I'd say it hits at its proof. 118. I don't feel like it's light. I don't feel like it's super intense either.
What do you feel about the structure of it? Does it feel kind of loose and flabby, or does it feel like it's a little bit more like rigid, like it's a foundation or a scaffolding that we could build upon? You don't have to answer that at this moment, but just kind of put that question in your mind.
Yeah, that's a good question. See, I'm getting that. Certainly, the rye is showing through. The spice structure is showing through. I'm not getting youthful notes per se, but I'm not getting a ton of, I would say, complexity either. I'm getting like a nice.
But there's definitely that rye. There's some boldness in the middle of it.
In the mid palate.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So for me, it doesn't have. I'm getting it in the mid palate. The aroma did jump out of the glass, and I'm getting that grain forward rye quality, which, if you like grain, grain forward. One of the reasons why you would select, a 4.5-year-old high rye bourbon is for a grain component, like an earthy, spicy. Maybe there's a tinge of sweetness there, but it's not necessarily going to provide a lot in the front of the mouth, and it's not necessarily going to provide a lot on the finish. But it kind of creates this cool mid palate with a strong grain expression.
Yeah, I'd say that's pretty right on. Move on to two. What's the second one here?
So then we got a Kentucky bourbon, 74% corn, 8% rye, 8% malted barley, 119.2 proof, and a 6-year-old. Wow, the nose is 100% different.
It's completely different. And we talk a lot about the mash bill and the importance of the mash bill. It's an interesting metric by which we kind of like build our idea of what a whiskey is. But when you taste two whiskeys like this, or even smell them, and they're so different even aromatically, a lot of that is not mash bill related. A lot of that is house yeast strain related, right? So, Indiana has very particular yeast, which creates sort of a house style, I think, across many of their mash bills. And I do get that in the first selection that we had. And then the second, which is a 6-year-old Barton barrel, is totally different. Totally different.
Yeah.
For me, it doesn't jump out of the glass quite as much.
But there is some depth
flavor
there. And I am getting, it is characteristically Barton on the nose. So I'm definitely getting some of those familiar notes.
I'm getting a lot of chocolate malt balls.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Are you getting that in the mid, or if imagine your tongue? Imagine you divide your tongue, and the tip of your tongue is like, let's call it number 1, and the back of your tongue with the back of your mouth is number 5. Where are you getting the chocolate? Where are you feeling the chocolate malt balls?
Mid to late.
Mid to late, right? Like 3, 4, 4.5, maybe, not quite to 5.
Yeah,
that's where I'm getting it too. And that sort of chocolate, kind of malty, creamy, kind of expansive, more viscous. That a lot of that is coming from the wood, right? This is another part of whiskey making that often I don't think gets the respect that it deserves, is the wood, right? If the wood is contributing, what percentage do we usually think? I don't know. More than 70% of the flavor, more than 60% of the flavor in a bourbon. If that's coming directly from the wood, primarily extraction of compounds from the wood, one of the things that I love when we're procuring whiskey from other distilleries is to learn more about their cooperage choices that they make. Why did you get it's one thing to have a mash bill, right, which is going to create kind of a style, and then it's a totally another thing to make the choice as a whiskey maker of what cask, right, your whiskey's going to live in, because that choice, even more than yeast strain and mash bill, is going to determine the character of that whiskey. It's like the most important choice, and which is for me why the coopers, the barrel makers, are like the coolest. They're the ones that really contribute most of the character to what we call American whiskey. It comes from the choices that the coopers are making in their trade. And one thing that we do at Three Chord is we do highlight. I've got a bunch of specialty casks behind us that we have custom made for us that we love talking about and giving samples from. And one of the things that we do is sort of try to shine a spotlight on some of the coopers, because they're really the ones that are creating more of the flavors in American whiskey than even the distillers.
Yeah, talk about less too. It's certainly not a heavy focal point when whiskey is being talked about. Distillation is far more. What I always think about when I think about wood over the years and whiskey barrels over the years, it's that photo that pops up every once in a while on social media where you just see the tightness of the grains of the wood, how that's changed over time as we're growing trees faster and applying fertilizers and these techniques for that fast growth, and you get a different grain wood than you had 20 years ago or 40 years ago or 60 years ago or whenever you want to compare, and you talk about how whiskey tasted different, or Dusties that are 60 years old taste different than whiskeys today, and you wonder how much is influenced by just the change in how trees are growing now comparatively to how they grew way back when, and how much that contributes to it.
Amazing point in this idea of old growth oak having a ton more compounds, and a 600-year-old tree having more going on in terms of complexity than a 60-year-old tree or an 80-year-old tree seems like pretty intuitive, right? These old growth oak trees. So the interesting thing about Dusties is that what we know from many of these old bottles is that, number one, they didn't control fermentation or cleanliness, right? In nearly the way that we can now. We're now experts on things like fermentation, which may have been a little haphazard back then. Plus, the grain quality now, I think, is in general a lot higher than the grain quality was 100 years ago. That being said, they may have had superior wood, right? So certain things get better and certain things don't. And one of the challenges for whiskey makers these days is, and this is fun, trying to find sources of old growth oak that maybe can then either be coopered into barrels or at least coopered into the heads of barrels. We have casks behind us where that are both American and French oak, right? Hybrid barrels where the staves are one thing and then the heads are where the staves are American oak and the heads are French oak. And that kind of complexity in a finishing barrel, with two different types of wood, I think it translates directly into a more complex and oftentimes compelling spirit. Not always, but oftentimes.
Yeah, for
Should
sure.
we try number 3?
Absolutely.
So number 3 is, we're really happy about this one. This is a really unique barrel. It's a 16-year-old Tennessee barrel that we were talking a little bit earlier. A lot of the 16-year-old Tennessee barrels, or I should say 10-plus-year-old Tennessee barrels that we get come in at a fairly low proof, usually between 100 and 110 proof. Because a decade and a half ago, they made a decision to use a lower barrel entry proof, which I think was a really great decision. We've had many barrels from Tennessee over 12 years old, and this is the highest proof one that we've ever found, so we wanted to share it with you.
Oh.
It's 124 proof.
That's got
16-year-old Tennessee whiskey.
just fantastic color too. It's hard to see, but
Yeah.
the color is absolutely incredible on this bourbon.
That's pretty amazing whiskey right there. But one of the things we do as blenders is try to understand each of these whiskeys in terms of what are the components of it that express really well, and then what are the components that maybe don't express quite as well or could be supported or bolstered by another whiskey, right? So for instance, with these 3 whiskeys, from a blender's point of view, one of the things that would be really interesting is to take that 16-year, and correct me if I'm wrong, where is this 16-year hitting you in your palate? Is it the entire mouth, or is it primarily towards the end? Where does it really, after you take the initial sip, where is it lingering? Where is it sitting in your palate?
I have an answer. What are you thinking, Nick?
The spice is staying up front, but it's the flavors moving back.
Yeah.
The spice that lands on my tongue and it kind of stays there.
Yeah.
And then the flavor moves backward there.
Yeah. There's like a sequence going on, at least in my mouth. And what's interesting is we all have very different ways of sensing what's going on in our mouth. But sometimes we have the same experience and sometimes we don't. But yeah, I'm getting like, as it is in my mouth, it feels like it's working its way back.
Yeah.
And I feel like it hits at the end there. It's just so oaky and caramely and chocolatey.
There's like a lot. It's very dense flavor as well.
Yeah.
Like it's like there's a lot of reduction in this barrel, right? So just like if you're leaving a sauce to reduce on your stove all day and let those flavors just as the volume goes down, the flavors get more and more concentrated. That's definitely going on here.
Yeah.
There's a constant. It's like a bouillon cube of whiskey. It's just like a lot going on.
It is. I would wonder if the yield on this was low.
Yes.
On this barrel, and it's obviously 84.88. It's Tennessee. We know where it's from, right? It certainly got that. It certainly has that flavor, but it's really one of the best barrels I feel like I've tasted, from Tennessee in quite a while. Absolutely fantastic barrel.
I love Tennessee whiskey. Tennessee is slightly hotter than Kentucky. Right? The entire Ohio River Valley, which would include really the locations of each of these distilleries, are within the same geographic area. Yes, they're all in different political states, but in terms of climate and geography, this is all, as far as the USDA is concerned, kind of a single area, right? With similar maturation conditions.
Right.
Except Tullahoma is a little bit warmer. it's like a half a USDA zone hotter than Southern Indiana in Kentucky.
Yeah.
I think that comes through in the spirit. I think that there's a concentration of flavor that, if you have water with you, put a little bit of water into the sample and see what happens. One of the interesting things about these barrels that you have so much reduction is the flavor can sometimes almost be so bound up that if you add some water, it really does open up. You really do get layers of flavor. So feel free to add water if you care to this one, just to get to know that component a little bit better. But as far as a blend, you might conceive of a blend and then you try it and it can be totally different. So I would suggest, as a starting point for working on this, that we make 2 blends. The first one, I'd like to take would essentially be like 20 mils of the Indiana. Do you have a graduated cylinder?
Got
Or something of the
pipettes.
like? Perfect.
3 pipettes, 1 for each sample.
Perfect.
So ratios are good. So
ratios are good. So
makes it easy.
I might even say 4 parts Indiana, 1 part Tennessee. And then I think we should do 4 parts Kentucky, 1 part Tennessee. In experience, how does the 16-year-old very dense flavor contribute, particularly in the back end, to these other 2 whiskeys? How does it complement it?
Okay.
Yeah. So I was taking some notes there. You said 4 Indiana, 1 Tennessee first.
Yep. And then 4 Kentucky, 1 Tennessee for the next.
That's right.
Okay.
And the idea there is that we use the Tennessee is sort of as a back end. That the Indiana and the Kentucky both had really nice, I believe, mid palates, but kind of faded a little bit towards the end. So we're trying to bolster the back of the palate here by adding just about 20%. And 20% can be, I would usually start lower, like 10%, 15%, 20%, and taste those 3 next to each other. But for the sake of this, let's just start at 20%. So I'm adding my 4 parts Indiana. And now I'm adding my 1 part Tennessee.
And so interestingly too is, instead of just jumping in and starting something with all 3, it's let's try 2 and let's leave 1 as the correlating, as you just explained there, to see those differences. And I can't say that would necessarily be intuitively obvious as a first step. I think it might, you might just say, look, I probably would have said, let me do 50% 1, 25 the other 2, and then mix it up and take that right down the line to see what that is. I don't know that I would necessarily have just chosen 2 for that comparison to start.
50-50. So sometimes what you'll do is start with 3 different ones where it might be 25, 75, then 50-50, and then 75-25 in the other direction. And you get a sense between those 3, which one is filling out the most, which one fills up the most space, which one's the most complex, or which one is popping out for whatever reason you might think. And then, in a perfect world, if we had like 6 hours, we would do that for number 2 as well. It's really easy when you change 1 variable at a time to end up with a lot of glasses in front of you. I'm sure you've experienced that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I know from experience, because I previously did some blends with these, that the 20% certainly changes the character of what we would call the base spirit. The base spirit in this case is Indiana, which is being framed, I would say, by Tennessee. And so see, with your memory of what the Indiana was like by itself, see how this relates to that. I'm going to actually try them next to each other. This is just the Indiana, and this is the Indiana with 20% Tennessee.
So the first one, 4 parts Indiana, 1 part Tennessee. That Tennessee component definitely pulls the Indiana's forward rye spice down a notch, add some layers of complexity to it.
Mm-hmm.
Nose is still expressive.
I'm still getting, you're right, the graininess is diminished, but it's still, I feel like I'm still getting that initial aroma that we talked about. I'm still getting that, but it's a lot more full on the backside. We divided our tongue into 5, 1 at the beginning and 5 at the end. I feel like I'm lacking at like 2. Like 1 to 2 seems like there's something missing there to me. But I do love the aroma and I love the finish of it. Let it sit, let it aerate. It's a pretty high proof sample. So let it chill for a second. It will blow off some of the more aromatic or some of the more volatile compounds. And then it's going to be just a little bit more approachable. But I think that's really interesting. I do think that from a spirit perspective, that's an improvement for me on the Indiana by itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's try the same thing with the Kentucky.
And a very smooth nose to it.
Mm-hmm. Which one is that?
The Kentucky Tennessee one.
You're ahead of me.
No.
I'm not getting as, I guess, I don't know, obvious of an improvement. It's not as dramatic as an improvement as the first one, the Indiana Tennessee. Still getting that almost malty. I think what'd you say, chocolate malt balls, Eric? That's definitely still there.
Mm-hmm.
I think it might be a little too even.
Right?
Yeah.
Like it's I don't want to say it's one note, right?
Yeah, but
it's missing. It feels like something's missing.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost less character than it was on its own. It's something's diminished there, and it's more flatline.
And therein is the complexity of blending. 1 + 1 does not always equal 2. You can add the same quantity to one whiskey and it improves it. And you add the same whiskey to another whiskey and it doesn't necessarily improve it.
Mm-hmm.
And there would be no way to intuit that, right? We couldn't deduce that without actually tasting it.
Sure,
and that's why blending is primarily a sensory activity.
Yeah.
In a perfect world, blending takes place over the course of quite a long while, right? And blends kind of come together slowly. But I'm more partial to the first one of those. Now, having experienced both of those and kind of understanding it, would you like to blend the Indiana? We can go in 2 directions here. We can either adjust the blend on the Indiana in Kentucky, right? Or the Indiana in Tennessee, our first blend. We can adjust the blend on number 2, right? Or we can blend Kentucky and Indiana, which we have not done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would probably say that. Try Kentucky and Indiana. I'm curious how that comes together since we're kind of doing the by 2s, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to do the same parts or equal amounts of each?
It would be good. How big are the samples that you're making?
I think I'm going to have to shrink my size a little bit. I'm just looking at my my samples here. I'm guessing I'm thinking I might be good for a solid like 12 to 15 if I really stretch it, maybe more than that.
I would say do as small a sample as you can that you can taste. I say let's try a 50-50.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's a good
There
idea.
is a possibility here that a 50-50 between Kentucky and Indiana, they could build off one another, and then we could talk about adding in some Tennessee to kind of fill out the back end. Because again, I really do like that aroma that's popping out from the Indiana that I'm not getting from the Kentucky. I don't necessarily want that aroma to be discounted. One thing I'll say while we're blending is at Three Chord we use these 50 milliliter graduated cylinders that we put our little sticker on top of. I don't know if you can see it.
Yep.
This is a really cool tool to have at your home bar because 50 milliliter gives you a really decent sized drink that you can sit with for a little while. And if you have this at your home bar, you go from having a bunch of bottles to a bunch of potential inputs into a whiskey, into a glass that doesn't exist anywhere else, right? So if you can keep a book, a blending book on your home bar with just a 50 milliliter graduated cylinder, you will always have a unique spirit that maybe you can find something that you really love.
And Ari, you're just talking about somebody buying multiple bottles off the shelf and blending those, right? I mean, we're obviously going straight from barrels that many people wouldn't necessarily have the opportunity to get and make it a final product, but really any products you can blend at home. And I know a lot of people do infinity bottles and things like that. A lot of people do home blending, but I'm not sure it's something that is on everybody's radar. And it's easy to do. You have bottles at home right now. You can blend right along with what we're doing, even
particularly single barrels.
Yeah, I was just going to say everyone's got a single barrel. So
yeah, single barrels work really well. Or you there's no reason if you can blend a Scotch and a bourbon. There are no rules. There's nobody telling you what you can and can't do. And my suggestion would be play around with it. Make a whiskey. Always write down what you blend if you're going to blend it, because if it is good and you want to recreate it, the only way you're ever going to be able to do that is if you write it down. But yeah, it turns your home bar into like a participatory thing where you get to be creative. Indiana, Kentucky, 50-50. What are your thoughts?
I like the nose.
It's got a nice caramel forward flavor with some more structure. I feel like the Kentucky got the added structure from the Tennessee on the palate, and even it's kind of sweeter, and it's still got enough of that rye structure with it. I'd say this is an improvement on both of them.
I agree. I think that's really interesting. What do you think about taking this 50-50 and say, let's do 2 parts Kentucky, 2 parts Indiana, and then 1 part Tennessee? Again, I think about, if this blend that we just made, which is really interesting, actually, it's still going on. It's still changing on my palate. I'm having it's not staying in one place. There's some good complexity there. But again, I feel like it is lacking towards the back.
I think it does. I agree. It's a little grainy on the finish, and it sticks with you. And I feel that Tennessee, with such a strong finish, is going to maybe pick that up.
Let's do it. Let's do like 2 parts Kentucky, 2 parts Indiana, 1 part Tennessee, So that's 40%, 40%, 20%.
Mm-hmm. Know if it's you can't see the comparison of color. I was going to try to highlight the color comparison, but just looking at the color on that Tennessee is definitely notable. I can't say that color is always something I take note of, but sometimes when it is a really vibrant or deep color, it's very noticeable. This is definitely one of those bourbons that has that very notable depth of color.
Color in American whiskey is one of those interesting things. Oh, let's be honest. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors in the whiskey industry internationally. And one of the things that, even old, I had a very old Scotch the other day, and it was beautiful, very dark color. And I looked at it and I was like, this is a very fake looking Scotch. Someone went to the trouble of aging a Scotch for a really long time and then added a bunch of caramel coloring into it. So the consumer would look at it and say, oh, this is so old. And you look at it and this is just not a color that you would get from oak. This is a color that you would only get from caramel. And you don't get that with American whiskey. American whiskey doesn't have caramel. Straight whiskey, these whiskeys do not have any caramel color or anything added to them. So it is cool to be able to look at a whiskey and it does indicate something to you. Even wine, right? I have a background in wine. In wine tasting, you're taught to like hold it up to the glass and look at it. But wine color is very much engineered these days. Right? There are products that give a winemaker incredible ability to choose what a wine's going to look like, how cloudy it's going to be. Is it going to be opaque? Do you want it to be more ruby or more purple or have a lighter tinge or brown, right? Which is traditionally a sign of maturity in wine. All of this in the wine, or much of this in the wine industry, is engineered these days with chemicals and colorants. We don't have that with straight whiskey. It's no BS in that way.
And non-straight bourbon as well. So if it's got if it's bourbon, it does not have those added colors. Although we recently talked about this. Certainly different when you see, bourbon aged in or added whatever to it, so you'll see a lot of different flavorings and things like that. That's when you do sometimes need to ask the deeper question of what is it exactly and what are they doing to make it, because then it gets into the whiskey specialty category, which does allow for some different things to be done, but not everybody is doing those things, or they're doing things very, very differently, even though they may fall in the same category. So that's where asking the questions of the company making it becomes a very, very wide range of things in that category. That if you care about what's going into the bottle, you ask the question and you'll find some very different answers out there.
That's a great insight that you just provided. And what I think is some of the products that we produce here at Three Chord, again, we very proudly write blended on the label and are very transparent about what goes into it and how we make it. But one of the points of straight whiskey is to not allow for innovation. In a sense, it has to be made a traditional way, the same way. You can't, innovation is not a friend of the straight bourbon world. It's a threat to the straight bourbon world.
Right.
That being said, there are some really cool, innovative whiskey companies out there that are doing things to whiskey to improve it, that also make the straight designation have to be removed to the label. So, not having straight on the label doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't something really cool and innovative and creative going on there. But again, you have to trust the company to be transparent about it, which is, sometimes easier said than done.
Yeah.
Cheers. I'm really looking forward to trying this one.
Cheers.
Cheers. The silence of people drinking whiskey on camera.
It's the best. I'm just looking at your faces. I'm seeing the smiling kind of. Ours, chewing, and all of a sudden a smile kind of comes on your face.
Yeah. This one, there's a lot going on. I think there's a lot of complexity here. For me, it is hitting the different places in my mouth, and what I'm wondering is if it's not too jumbled. I can still pull out the different strains. It doesn't taste like any of the one component. I can't pull out this component or that component. It's actually kind of melding fairly well. My question is it, and you kind of mentioned this earlier, is it getting like muddled a little bit, or are you still kind of getting the peaks in the complexity that we had in the previous blend that was the Kentucky and Indiana together?
I think there's a little muddleness going on, but the flavor and it's really good.
Yeah.
I really enjoy that one.
Yeah, I would say without question, the Tennessee is for me the most interesting flavor profile of the group. But both the Indiana and Kentucky bring different things to the mix. As we went from the 50-50 to now the 50-50 or the 2-2-1 part split here, it's pulling a little bit off of that more straightforward caramel rye structure. Not one note, but I guess maybe more two note. And I'm starting to get some of those flavors you get with a Tennessee bourbon. I don't know if it's enough that if I tasted it without knowing it was there, I would know Tennessee was the component, but I'd say it's just starting to kind of, I guess, tickle that thought that there might be some of that more familiar Tennessee component in there.
And again, so I'm not a painter. I've never been a painter, but being at home with my kids for a year and a half, or spending more time with them than I previously got to, one of the things we started doing was watching Bob Ross in painting.
Love Bob Ross.
Love Bob Ross. And what his approach to color, like when you're painting a tree, which is, decide kind of what color you want the tree to be. And you can use these dark sort of blotches to give depth in the shadows. And then you use lighter colors in order to provide light in between the base color and the light in the shadows. You have a tree that has all kinds of depth in it. And sometimes when I try a whiskey like this one, where I do feel like there's like the Indiana component has a little bit more grain forwardness, the Kentucky, I think you kind of nailed it with the chocolate sort of malt characteristic. And then this Tennessee, which is just like a bit of a unicorn. It's kind of a really interesting barrel. I feel like there's just a lot of there's a lot of depth going on, and I'm just wondering if it's a little too. I'm going to add a little bit of water just to see if that helps unclutter the mid palate for me.
I went small, so I
did too.
I'm gonna blend again. This is the nice thing about these pipettes is you can pull together pretty small but pretty accurate blends very quickly. At least volume based blending. I mean, what we're doing here, of course, is all volume based. We're not trying to achieve a specific proof that, is going to be whatever it is at the end.
Whatever the
we're
label
trying to achieve a
says.
flavor profile, and it's got to be obviously varying components of each of the, varying percentages of each of the components to get there.
When we need to blend whiskey to hit a certain ABV, what we do is take all of the components right down to that ABV, and that's what we blend, so that, that you get rid of a variable that way, right? And that way you're only blending different whiskeys, but it's all at the same proof, and so it's not going to mess you up later.
Yeah.
So I have a question for you. Have you ever, in addition to, did you say this was the first time that you've blended whiskeys from different distilleries or different states and kind of seen that
Different
there's
states?
a complexity
Yep,
going
correct.
on?
Yeah. Yep.
Do you oftentimes as a group finish whiskeys in unique barrels? Is that something that you enjoy doing?
We have not. I don't think if we have done any of those yet, but it's something we are certainly eager to explore.
So, as you consider, what you would like for this blend to eventually be in a bottle, one thing that I think would be really interesting, and I want to offer it, is we could do something that we don't generally do, which is make a really interesting blend, and then we can finish it, if you're interested, in either a brand new toasted American oak barrel or a hybrid barrel that has both in French and American oak in the barrel. And if you're interested in it, we could take a blend, fill up that barrel, and then even mail you samples on sort of a regular basis. Because one thing that's really cool with blending is you can watch products mature and change over time. And if you haven't yet had the experience of watching a barrel, particularly an active new seasoning barrel, like a toasted oak or a hybrid oak, American French oak barrel, how it can change a whiskey even over a month or over 6 or 8 weeks. If you're interested, this would be I feel like would be an interesting blend to put into a finishing barrel, and then sample it every 2 weeks and let us send you samples.
So does that make you nervous sometimes when you do a blend and you're like, man, do I want to test it? Do I want to, do I love it the way it is, or do I put it in here and try to do it something more? Or is it, are you afraid it's going to change it too much?
So cask management, in American whiskey making, we do not usually check barrels before the timer goes ding and it hits like 4 years old or however old. We're very hands off when it comes to cask management. That's not the case in much of the world. And one thing that we love doing at Three Chord is we will make a blend, put it in a barrel, and then pull out samples and taste how that whiskey changes over time. Because things happen other than pulling out compounds. The whiskey finds a new equilibrium. And like I said, it kind of changes, but that changing barrel is, if you pull the whiskey out at the right time and don't let it sit in for too long or not too short, you can get flavors that you would never get in a whiskey otherwise. And the way you're getting them is by taking superior inputs and then blending them and then putting them in a barrel. That the barrels that we get, all of the staves have been yard aged for 36 months minimum. So we don't use kiln dried barrels. We again, the wood is the main flavoring component in the whiskey. If a whiskey company isn't like totally obsessed with cooperage and wood, then it's like scary. But what I find is that Speyside Cooperage, an independent stave company, and some of in other cooperages as well. There's a wonderful cooperage in West Virginia that we started working with. They're small, but they're mighty. It's like a boutique cooperage. And some of these whiskeys, particularly these blends, are able to pick up characteristics from American toasted oak that you can't get with charred oak. And if that were something that you're interested in, those sort of toffee butterscotch, silky viscosity gets added as well because there's some fatty acids or something in the wood. it's a fun thing to watch a barrel develop. And if you've never experienced it, I would love to give you the opportunity. But that's something that you can discuss.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
Interesting.
I'd say off the top, I'm excited about that. I agree. I feel like as you do that second barrel, tend to be whiskeys that I enjoy. It tends to add, if nothing more, it adds, depth and complexity that you aren't otherwise finding. I'm trying to think of some, I feel like sometimes there's a, like a toffee or chocolate note that tends to be, and it tends to be kind of notes that I tend to like in whiskey when they're, when they're there. We had played with and planned to do a Sauternes finish with Hill Rock. Our first selection we did with them, we decided just to go with it as is, and we said, "Well, wait, and we'll do the Sauternes finish next." And that was really that same concept that we were going to select first and then kind of roll the dice on the Sauternes finish, but based on their experience of of doing so and tasting what was absolutely fantastic and products, so the idea of taking,
They do an amazing job.
They do. They're incredible people. I mean, just an incredible process. The distillery is just a lovely, beautiful place. I mean, you talk about people doing this because they just love what they do. I mean, that's exactly what they are out there. So that was a great experience, and looking forward to going back there again. But that idea of taking something good already and adding that layer of finish to it, or depth and complexity, I think I'm personally very excited about about doing that. So what do you think of this one, Eric? Did you do one with add the water to it?
Yeah, I did. And I think I preferred it a little bit more with the water.
Oftentimes that's what happens when you get a jumble of flavors. Sometimes we know this. It opens up the whiskey. It de-jumbles and it kind of puts things in a more ordered place.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's the high alcohol that's keeping a whiskey from coming together. So even just dropping it 1 or 2 proof can change that balance.
Yeah, I would say I probably agree with you on that. I didn't add too much water. I
didn't either. I did 4 tiny drops.
Yeah, I would say no
and
more.
I'm already working with a little bit, so it was.
Yeah.
Well, while we sit with this for a minute, I wanted to tell you one of the things that we're doing at Three Chord that's really interesting that I wanted to share with you, and we're able to talk about it now, is we are transitioning from exclusively sourcing whiskey made, essentially aged whiskey that we buy once it's ready, to a production process where we are actively now working with 5 good-sized distilleries across the country, making custom spirits, mash bills, yeast strains, cooperage at 5 different distilleries. And each of those are designed to be blending components in our whiskeys. So this is not a model that I'm aware of any other United distillery in the States having, but it's a little bit more in line with, say, what Johnny Walker does, where they contract distillation out to 30 or 40 distilleries for their blends. We're only doing it right now with 5. But I think what you're going to start seeing is some really interesting 3 chord spirits that were designed to be blending components, but that might be really good and interesting by themselves as well. So we've had an interesting transition from moving from simply being a blending house to also, there's not even necessarily a word for it. We're not distillers necessarily, but we are contracting distillation for custom whiskeys at 5 different distilleries that each have their own style that we appreciate, that we're trying to highlight in the whiskeys that we're making with them.
Different states, Ari?
Yes. So in Indiana, Tennessee, Kentucky, and North Carolina. And
interesting.
North Carolina is interesting for many reasons, but the history of Appalachian whiskey making is older than the history of Kentucky bourbon.
Hmm.
And we're tapping into some of that pre-bourbon history by working in Appalachia, aging spirit in Appalachia, sourcing grains that are grown in Appalachia. And that's a part of America's whiskey making tradition that, again, isn't often discussed.
You mentioned Johnny Walker too. I think the idea of a blended Scotch, and the skill it takes to blend all those different components and create what ends up being a consistent product that is consistent from blend to blend and year to year, and working with what have got to be variations of components, but finding that consistency. It's interesting because here in American whiskey, it seems that the new norm is maybe to some extent inconsistency. It's finding something new that hasn't been discovered yet, and then seeing what boundaries can be pushed in different directions with those various components. I mean, just thinking about the components we have here, there's certainly qualities of each of these that are familiar qualities of those distilleries in those states, that as you start to bring stuff together, and look, there's distilleries here in New York that have a very, unique flavor to them that in some cases people may not even like on their own, or they're really different and unique on their own. But as things start to blend together, you find that you can play with and pull in some of those fantastic traits into other whiskeys. And I love where that stuff is going, because it really does bring new flavors, to the mix, and it builds on what's already here.
We're living right now in a time where, thankfully the market for whiskey is strong enough that that whiskey makers that can push the boundaries and can be innovative have a market to go to with that product if they do it well, right? So there is the opportunity for innovation now that the American whiskey industry hasn't seen in over 100 years. And we're starting to see it. And you mentioned Hill Rock. Hill Rock is one of the places, what Dave Pickerel was able to do at many distilleries, is part of that story, right? Rebuilding an American blending tradition. American blended whiskeys were a big deal for a long time until they weren't, because of consolidation in the industry. And consolidation in the industry led to products that were a little bit more identical one to the next. And so we've lost some diversity in terms of flavor. But we're seeing that come back now. It's coming back because of heirloom grains, because of more careful selection of cooperage. People are doing amazing work with yeast strains. And so I feel like whiskey makers are now reconceiving of whiskey production every step of the process, from the grain inputs to what kind of still we're using. I don't know if you've had the 3-chamber still rye. That's incredible.
We have,
in Colorado. And,
Yep.
and we're rethinking every single step of the whiskey making process. And from a blender's perspective, the way we see it is, when we're distillers, we say that where brewing stops, where fermentation stops, that's where distilling starts. That's where you turn your beer into whiskey. And now you have blenders, Three Chord and others, saying, okay, when distilling stops, then you start this whole maturation process. And that can be a lot more hands-on and interesting, and you can do things with the maturation, with proper cask management. And blending kind of starts where the maturation ends. And that's really where you get to, and again, this is where the bartenders also really understand how you can, just like you can tweak a cocktail by just adding a little bit of this or that. You can add a little bit of sugar to a cocktail, not necessarily enough sugar to make it sweet, but enough to extend the flavors. You might not even perceive it as sweetness. It just highlights the flavor, like salt and caramel, right? It just highlights the flavor. And I think that over the next couple of years, we're going to start seeing more and more whiskeys pushing the boundaries of flavor and what you can do, and unique cooperage is part of that. And blending is a big part of that.
Yeah, that's great. So I feel like I want to try something that's a little heavier on the Tennessee.
Let's do it.
So where would you move from here, Eric? As far as if you were to say let's throw a dart at the board, where would you throw it?
Well, I think when we did the Tennessee and Kentucky, we already have an idea. They were very friendly with each other. And I think going any more with Tennessee, with the Kentucky, I think it's going to be in that same range, but you're just going to be able to taste the Tennessee more and it's going to stick out. So I think we're going to have to play with the Indiana with the Tennessee and maybe then use the Kentucky as a smaller agent to it.
Would you?
Yeah.
So
go
ahead, Ari.
No, Eric.
I don't know. I mean, Ari, what are you thinking about the parts then? The ratios.
Do you feel like you're more drawn? I think we need to up Tennessee a little bit. We've been playing with it at the 20%.
So definitely increase that.
Do you feel like we should be highlighting the Indiana or the Kentucky more? What's your gut?
The Indiana.
Okay.
Since I'm saying that the Tennessee is already playing with it too much, so let's really kind of play with it, Indiana, Tennessee, and then kind of gently put in the Kentucky part.
We were also at 20 to 80 Tennessee to Kentucky on that blend too, so it was a very low Tennessee against Kentucky. When we did do that, we may find that as you move the needle on the Tennessee against the Kentucky, the Tennessee, my guess, frankly, would be that Tennessee is going to quickly overpower it as you amp up.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say too. I think it's going to stick out too much.
It's going to just overflow. You hit that right, and it just suddenly all you taste is the Tennessee, even if it's not 100% of the blend.
Would you be interested in like a 2 parts Indiana, 1 part Kentucky, 1 part Tennessee, which would mean that Tennessee is going from 20% to 25%, right? So that's going up. The Kentucky's coming down from 40% to 25%, and the Indiana's pulling up the slack. Would that be an interesting blend? Like 2 parts Indiana, 1 part Kentucky, 1 part Tennessee?
So we're pulling Kentucky down 1. I mean, I honestly would like to say 2 parts Tennessee on that and see what that. But we could transition to that too.
Sure. Or we could do a 40-40. So we could do like 2 parts Indiana, 2 parts Tennessee, 1 part Kentucky.
Yeah, that's I was thinking, like push the needle up high, see if it's too high, and then we back off it versus creeping up. I guess so you get to the same place either way, but sometimes I like to push to the boundary and then go back.
I like it.
Kind of see what it what it does.
So 40 Tennessee, 40 Indiana, 20. Kentucky.
That's what I got. Interesting that Kentucky seems like it's a nice, I guess, base whiskey in a sense too, that it's probably the least, I don't know, powerful of these 3.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go too much of it, I think you drown everything out.
That's right. So that's the risk you take with some of the older whiskeys is, again, imagine you're like painting the shadows into a tree. You can go too much with the shadows and lose the tree.
Yeah.
But if you don't go enough, you're not going to have the depth. And so that's where I think a lot of these older whiskeys are even more compelling as a blending component sometimes than they are as, say, a single barrel.
Mm-hmm. I love the painting analogy too, Ari. That's I don't think I've heard that analogy in blending before, but I feel like I'm going to be using it a lot now. So I apologize.
Nick, that's It is literally the first time I've ever said it, so I'm glad that you enjoyed it. Usually the analogy we use, because it has a lot to do with how the blending house concept came about in the first place, is Neil Giraldo, our founder, is a music producer. Mm-hmm. He works the mixing boards. He's also a musician. He was the first guitar player ever on MTV. He's produced and performed on albums that he sold like 60 million albums. But one thing that his creative process is very musically oriented. And when he and I are blending whiskeys together, he loves to talk about, not in terms of shadows and light, but he talks in terms of like bass and treble. And he would taste this Tennessee and he would understand that that's like the rhythm track in a song. And then maybe some of the more aromatics, that's kind of like the melody. And then you've got the structure, which is like, I don't know, some other part of it. So for him, he has a lot of musical orientations. Turns out I love painting with Bob Ross, and that works for me. But I think that almost every art form has got, how do you express depth in perception? Mm-hmm. How do you go the dark parts and the light parts, and what's going to be the structure? That kind of balance exists in all kinds of art forms, right? And so, yeah, I think the painting analogy might be apt, and you can use it it's yours now.
Well, I used to get out paints as a kid and literally paint along with Bob Ross. At our age, I mean, you think back, we didn't have Netflix. We didn't have the just exorbitant amount of entertainment that exists today. And I look at my kids and just how much is at their fingertips. You had a couple things to watch ever, and if you didn't, have cable, you had some free channels on an antenna, so
Bob Ross was on the free antenna. Right?
You had a limited amount of that, and man, you were into it though. Whatever it was, you were into it, and it was certainly memories as a child, watching his show and painting along with him, and good memories too. I mean, he's just the way he talks and just talks through it is just it's something else. I mean, it's the most calming thing to watch. If you're stressed, just turn on Bob Ross and watch him paint something. You'll melt. You'll be just a puddle by the end of it.
In the spirit that he brings to it, I mean, he shares creativity, right? He invites the audience to come and be creative. That kind of participation, it moves it. It's not just entertainment, right? It's asking you to participate and contribute in some way. Again, kind of how our do-it-yourself attitude about blending. Participate, create something. Maybe it's better than what's on your shelf. Even in the nose, the added Tennessee component is coming through. I'm getting some really nice aromatics here. Mm-hmm. The Tennessee and the Indiana play nicely together. Are you getting the chocolatey, malty character? Is that coming through at all, or is that lost?
I think some of the maltiness is lost, but the chocolatey is still there. Like, I feel like it transitioned to a heavier chocolate.
Is it the bitterness of the 16-year kind of made it seem like even a darker?
Yeah,
chocolate?
Maybe. Mm-hmm.
It drops the sharpness though. At first, I thought, okay, it's starting to be more Tennessee heavy. That's certainly a strong player in the mix, even though it's less than half of it. But went back, tasted it on its own. It's very different still from just the Tennessee on its own as a comparison, which definitely has, as interesting as it is, it certainly has some rough notes to it, or some rough edges to it, I guess, that are smoothed out by the blend here.
It is a little rougher than the last one we did. I think it was the last one. It's you really get that Indiana at the beginning, and then the Tennessee still at the end. And it is a little more dynamic. It's a little rougher versus the last one that was a little more even. That we were like, well, it's a little muddy, but we added the water to it.
My curiosity would be, if you finished it, would you want something that was more even going into it? Or, or would you want something that, I mean, this is more poignant than the previous blend too. It's certainly got that Tennessee, it's got that kick to it. It's got the rough edges to it. Would you want that, or would you want something that's a little tapered back, that's going to take maybe the barrel notes better in a finish, or not? What do you think, Ari?
I think that French oak will highlight a lot of that roughness, and I think American toasted oak will take that roughness and almost give it a candy coating. It kind of smooths out the roughness with the sweetness of toffee and caramel. So I personally enjoy a little bit of rough. Like, I like some char. You should know that it's 121 or 122. Yeah. You should feel it. You should know it.
Right.
And it's an agricultural product, right? This is made from wood and grain and in fungi, which is an important component in it too. And I personally prefer this blend to the previous ones. I like the higher, heavily aged component. But what I do think, I'm even getting a nice, like, some of the funk, right? There's from the Tennessee, I pull even, like, you said bitter chocolate, or like darker chocolate. I'm getting even like coffee.
Yeah.
And I personally think this would be really interesting, less so in a hybrid barrel and more so in a toasted barrel, because those dark chocolate notes and those almost coffee notes would be complemented, I think, by aromatics. It's something that this is lacking. This is very heavy. This is not incredibly heavy, but it is back heavy in terms of in the back of my palate. It's not as light to me as it was previously in the front, which is why I think that having those aromatics from new toasted oak would be interesting. That being said, I also just kind of like this as it is. It's also nice that way.
I did a small blend. I'm doing another one just to.
Are you changing the proportions?
No, I'm doing the same. I was going to add a little water to this one. Yeah. And see what it was real small, and see what the addition of water does to it, because the addition of water to the previous one definitely helped.
It improved it, right?
It did. And
higher proof isn't always better, because this is why, for instance, our 12-bar reserve, we released at 107 proof. 107 proof, I don't know. It's one of those magical proofs. Good things happen at 107 proof. It's lower than what a lot of people experience, but for whatever reason, a lot of whiskeys express really well there. And sometimes 122, the trick is to add a couple drops of water, and then the harmony starts happening.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I've talked with Neil about music, where he created a track and it was going great, but he's like, something's just a little bit off, and sometimes he'll slow it down like 5 beats per minute, just slow the track down a little bit, and he's like, there it is. I was just going this much too fast. And it just needed to slow down. And I feel the same way sometimes about adding water.
Yeah.
Proofing it down a little bit can just kind of, in a sense, almost bring it together.
Yeah, I'd say I probably added enough to bring it down to, I don't know, 116-ish, maybe. Not much, maybe 2 to 3 or so. It smooths the rough edges quite a bit.
It does. I think I kind of like it with the water.
Getting more The chocolate is more pronounced. I mean, you talked about the chocolate before. I was struggling to find it without the water. Honestly,
Mhm.
it with the Tennessee component, some of those sharper spice notes, and the Indiana component, some of the sharper spice notes seemed like they were overpowering. The chocolate's coming from, I think, the Kentucky component the most.
Mhm.
I'm getting
I
them
think I got
more.
it more from that than the Indiana or the Tennessee as well.
Yeah, I'm getting it more here, but I still like bottling at the high proof, right? I still like the ability to be the one to add the water,
Yes.
because sometimes you want that sharpness. Sometimes you just want it to kick you in the pants a little bit, and and other times you want the more complex, smoother on the tongue, type of type of feel. But I mean, George T. Stagg, there's a great example of just a bourbon that just great. I mean, some of the lower proof ones recently have not as much, but historically, and what the brand's known for is just grab your tongue and just kind of punch you a little bit, and it's what people love about it. That's what I love about it. Sometimes that's what you are looking for.
Yes.
Sometimes, and other times you're not.
It's like the
sometimes you
whiskey
gotta-
equivalent of like a deep tissue massage.
Yeah, that's it.
It's gonna hurt, but it's okay.
Right.
But it's also okay to add the water. You gotta, sometimes you gotta remember that, because it's even for myself, it's easy to forget that. I just pour it and I drink it, and I was like, drink it as is. And
Yeah.
That's right. And as I think we just experienced, it can change a whiskey dramatically just to add a little bit of water. From a
Mhm.
blending perspective, okay, great. Another variable means there's another infinite number of outcomes here. But to your point, with our whiskey drummer and with some of the other products that we come up with, we generally err on the side of bottling it at the highest proof that we really enjoy it. And then if you want to add your own darn water, add your own darn water. There's no right or wrong way to do it. And sometimes it's just, I don't generally add ice. I'm a kind of a room temperature water guy personally. Not that there's anything wrong with ice, but I am a fan of bottling it higher proofs and then adding water as you care to.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here?
So,
I don't know.
so right, and this is the artistic process is partially about making decisions, because the truth is we could have an amazing time and we could keep on coming up with blends, and we could argue their what we love and what we don't love about them. But here's what I think I've learned when I'm looking at my notes. We like a higher component of Tennessee. 20% is a little low. Up at 40% is kind of closer where we like to be with it. Indiana is the other main component, right? And how did you feel like Kentucky at 20%? Would you like that to be higher? In which case, I think we would bring Indiana. Let's keep Tennessee exactly where it is at 40%. The question is, Indiana at 40% and Kentucky at 20%. Would we like to adjust those? We could even do 30% Indiana, 30% Kentucky, 40% Tennessee. Or do you feel like it should lean in a direction of either Indiana or Kentucky?
I think I'd like to try the even Indiana, Kentucky. I like the chocolate notes that the Kentucky is bringing to the mix. If it's too much, it'll drown out some of the flavors. But if not, it's going to bring more of the chocolate into play. And I think the Tennessee is a strong component. So, I think that's still going to hold the structure of the whole whiskey at 40%.
So are you saying, so just if we're all in agreement, let's try Tennessee at 40%, Kentucky at 30%, Indiana at 30%, total of 100%. With Tennessee, instead of being sort of the supportive role, Tennessee is kind of moving into the middle of the picture here.
Good thing I just did dishes. I got plenty of glasses here. You can never have too many Glencairns. And so we are working with 3 individual barrels, Ari.
That's right.
Right. So these are, very, very unique individual characteristics. And then whatever, wherever we land, presumably all 53 gallon, right?
They're all 53 gallon now. The 16, like we said, the 16-year-old, the volume's greatly diminished there.
Mm-hmm.
So if the smallest volume that we have in a barrel becomes the largest component of the blend, that means the blend shrinks that much.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But
in
to get
ways,
the right blend, volume is going to be what it's going to be.
Exactly. Yeah. But also to some extent, non-repeatable exactly how it is, just like a single barrel. This is non-repeatable, certainly could batch with similar flavor notes, and I definitely, each of these has flavor notes that I think are flavor notes that are definitely repeatable. But the actual individual characteristics of the barrels, I think especially the Tennessee, is strong characteristics of an individual barrel are not exactly repeatable.
I really like the nose on this one.
Me too. Well, that's one of the reasons why I like these big rocks glasses.
Mm-hmm.
Really, you can get your nose in there, and there's a ton of headspace for all the volatiles to come and just sit on top of the liquid.
I like that.
That's my favorite one yet. We flipped the script. We took the Tennessee from the bottom, we put it on the top, and we're essentially using the other two, the more mid-palate and aromatic ones, to support that like really great dense structure of the great spice. And even further back, I'm starting to get the tobacco leaf. That's one of the flavors that's in there.
Mm-hmm. That's a flavor I love. When I get tobacco, I feel like that's a great flavor in whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
I love tobacco chocolate when I can find it.
And again, that's from toasted wood. That's behind the char level. That's where that flavor's coming in, and that's where a skilled cooper comes in, right? Your skilled cooper who knows how to create those compounds using heat, who knows how to create those compounds by identifying staves and getting the right type of wood and treating it correctly. That flavor that we love so much comes from the skilled work of a cooper who, again, we can all name 20 distillers, but how many coopers can we name? Like, I can't name very many.
Right.
It to me, they're the ones who are producing the majority of the flavor that we're tasting. So there's a great opportunity to start highlighting them a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. A previous tasting we did live, and actually visited their distillery and did a custom blend there recently out at Black Button in Rochester, New York. And what Jason talked about was how their distillate interacted with different barrels, and how he found that it worked well in some barrels, but didn't really play nicely with other barrels. And frankly, he was the first person I've heard talk in those terms about, and maybe just because the conversation doesn't come up that often, but talk in those terms about their unique distillate and how it just happens to work with a particular cooper. And I thought that was an
walking
interesting
away and have and actually walking away from a cooperage because he didn't think it worked with his particular whiskey.
Right. Yeah. And a great cooperage too. I mean, a cooperage that great whiskeys are made from, but certainly their distillery has a unique flavor to the distillate, as all do. And, he just noted that they didn't like what it did in those barrels, and that is very astute observation.
It takes a lot and I know Jason, I have a lot of respect for Jason. I have a lot of respect, not just for Jason as a person, but the company that he built and the spirits that they make. And sometimes you go and you visit all these distillers and they say, I use this cooper, and everyone's using the same cooper. And you go into that relationship with a cooper, and it's a serious relationship because, again, they're going to be contributing more of the character to the spirit than even you are, possibly, arguably. And you so want it to work that if it doesn't, you have to be very honest with yourself. And Jason has got the kind of character and can be honest with himself that, like, I thought this was going to work, but I'm tasting it and I'm saying it's not, and I'm going to change course. And not everyone can do that very well. But he's a great guy.
Definitely. Yeah.
What do you think about this one, Nick?
I added water to it too. Comparatively to the others, I actually like this one better without the water. I felt like it maybe was a little more controlled in the overall flavors without the water. I added the water, and for the first one of them, I felt like it was a little that watered down. That not necessarily, not in a bad way, but I didn't think it added like it added previously. Do I like this one better than the last one? I think maybe I had a little bit of last one left too. What do you think, Eric?
I'm liking this one the best.
I agree that putting Tennessee in the middle of the picture, to me, is making the most compelling blend that we've tried yet so far.
Mm-hmm. It got me curious to do a 50% Tennessee, 25-25 Kentucky, Indiana.
If you have the spirit for it, I'm so happy to try that. TN 50%, KY 25, IN 25.
I think we're getting close, so I feel like I'm safe to. I'm safe to approach the bottom of at least one of these, which then becomes the limiting factor, right?
Mm-hmm. A lot on the nose there.
Yep.
It's a great nose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I liked the previous one, and I thought that was going to be my favorite. I do actually like this one a lot. It does taste a little hotter. That 124 proof is showing a little bit, but to your point, sometimes that's okay. It's like the deep tissue massage.
Now, how much loss do you think we would see, or would that be negligible in the finishing barrel?
It's a great question. So typically in a barrel, you're going to lose 2 to 4 gallons, right? Pretty quickly by just absorption into the wood. So one of the things that I'd like to do with finishing barrels is give it the lightest. Again, put 2 to 4 gallons of water in it for 36 hours. Just let it get into the wood, let it soften the wood, and then if you put in the whiskey afterwards, it's going to increase your yield significantly at the end. Not because it was diluted with the water that you put in, just because the whiskey isn't getting absorbed into the wood because the water's already in there. So I would expect, depending on how long it's in there, a 3% reduction in volume, maybe.
So
2-3%, not very much. If you use sort of cask management, treat a barrel a little bit like a sponge by letting it soak for a minute, that's going to increase the yield.
And do you want to leave headspace when you fill that? If for a finishing like this, do you fill it 3/4 of the way, or fill it all the way? What's the?
I prefer to fill it all the way, fill it as much as possible, to have the greatest amount of surface area contact as possible.
And actually, back to the 2 to 3 gallons of water. So you would put in 2 to 3 or 2 to 4 gallons of water.
Yeah, I'd start with two. And that would get absorbed very quickly into the wood.
And that's going to sit on the bottom, but because it's sealed, that's going to more or less like soak up like a sponge inside the space, basically.
No, we'll roll it.
Oh,
so
okay.
We'll let the barrel sit on one side, then we'll roll it 90 degrees and kind of let it sit there. Then we'll roll it 90 degrees, until we look into it and it looks like the walls of the barrel are damp, but there's not really a puddle sitting there.
Gotcha. Okay.
At that point, if there's a puddle sitting there, you've added more water than you need to.
Gotcha.
Right.
And
so
then you dump it and you're fine at that point.
Exactly. That's exactly.
And then as it absorbs the whiskey, that water is going to evaporate, presumably out of the barrel, right? And the barrel is going to absorb the whiskey, but maybe not to the same extent that it just simply acts like a sponge on day one with the whiskey of just soaking it up, just because the wood is dry and it has that propensity to want, that moisture in it.
There is another technique that some people use, which is to use really clean steam to, and basically you prime the barrel with steam, which has a double effect of, number one, you're getting liquid into the wood so that, again, you're not losing more alcohol than you would like. And number two, it heats up the wood so much, it expands the wood, that allows even more sort of water in, and it frees up more of those compounds. Another thing that some people do with specialty barrels, especially in northern climates, is when it's cold outside, sometimes you want to take that barrel and kind of put it in a colder environment for 48 to 72 hours. That colder environment is going to slightly shrink the barrel and push the whiskey from the wood into the spirit. Again, you kind of at the end get a nice little hit of character. And we've done that where we put essentially cold whiskey into warm barrels, and as the whiskey expands into the wood, sometimes it will shoot the bung out across the room. It can create quite a bit of pressure in there. So we ratchet strap the bung, and that forces the whiskey to the wood. Yeah. And then, you have to ratchet strap it, or else the bung's going to be across the room and there'll be a little puddle of whiskey. But if you ratchet strap it, then the whiskey has nowhere to go but further into the wood.
Right.
And if you let that happen for like a week or so, and then take that barrel and put it in a cold climate, a walk-in cooler, or a northern climate outside in the winter, it's going to reshrink that barrel, pushing all of that whiskey back out of that wood. And like I said, you get a pretty serious hit of character. So it's a fun technique.
It's interesting thinking about, I think the question comes up a lot when you see proof go down, for example. And I think there's always a lot of questions about how is that possible that proof goes down. And anybody watching, we put together years ago barrel aging infographic. It's on breakingbourbon.com. Go to Breaking Bourbon, you just go to the search, just search bourbon barrel aging infographic, you'll find it. But kind of walks you through how just the basic concepts of how how whiskey ages in wood, how the proof can go up, how the proof can go down, what happens, different cycles, different impacts, very high level. But it is, it's interesting to think about, and where barrels are put in the rick house, and moisture and humidity levels and temperature fluctuation levels, and whether it's close to the side of the rick house or towards the center of the rick house, and all these variables that end up in many cases being the variables that create one brand versus another. It's the same mash bill, it's the same it's the same distillate, it's the same distiller, it's aged in the same rick house, but the flavor profiles end up being different, that the companies find those barrels that tend to exhibit certain flavors, and that becomes a particular brand, and that has its unique flavor. So it's an interesting exploration into how whiskey ages in the barrel and what happens during that time.
That's right. One of the other interesting things, there's so much that happens in the barrel, and a lot of that information has been sort of hoarded by big companies, by like the 6 or 7 big distilleries. But now, with work that's being done at University of Kentucky, work that's being done at Michigan State University's artisan distilling program, I think Montana State is doing some research, if I'm not mistaken. University of Wisconsin is doing some interesting work. We're learning more through these public institutions about the processes of maturation, which really until this point the public didn't know anything about. Beam Suntory knows about it. Heaven Hill knows about it. The big players know about it. It's not necessarily in their best interest to share that information. But now that the information is coming out about maturation, to your point about temperature, for instance, we're learning that the temperature of the liquid inside of a rick house, that cold spirit can hold twice as much dissolved oxygen as warm spirit. And that dissolved oxygen can drive esterification reactions, which will produce all kinds of cool aromatics, particularly fruity flavors. And that comes from keeping the liquid cold. Like who had thought that you create better aromatics, or certainly certain types of aromatics, by keeping the liquid cold. It had always been thought of like warmer is always better for maturation. And if you follow the warmer is better, then it would make sense that like Texas, or certainly parts of Texas, would be better aging conditions for bourbon than, say, Kentucky, right? If you follow that. Or if you're looking for fluctuations in temperature, if that's the variable that you feel like the whiskey entering and exiting the barrel as it expands and contracts, if that's where a lot of the flavor comes from, then now you can get on the USDA website, and you can find out exactly which microregions in the United States have the greatest fluctuation of temperature, and you could just build a rick house there and store everything there. And so there's just this. There's a lot of information coming out, and it is possible to separate the signal from the noise, and kind of figure out, okay, what are the techniques that can be used to create more enjoyable whiskey, or at least something that's fun to think about.
Yeah, no, it's great. This sharing of knowledge, and I think craft distillers are. I think we're finally really seeing craft whiskey come to that point where it's legitimately good. Been through the trials and tribulations, had some time to age. And that's exciting, because there's a learning curve in whiskey that you just unfortunately cannot fake. You need time. You got to see how it goes. And I think we're to that point where we're starting to see some great, interesting things going on. Craft distillers producing great spirits, the knowledge being shared. It's not just the big companies, but they're doing fantastic too, and produce great whiskey for a low price. But now with all the variety across the country, in different processes and distilleries and everything else, I think it's an exciting time for whiskey. That's what That's why we're here.
Craft
doing this,
distilling is
'cause
growing
we're
up.
excited about it.
Yeah, craft distilling is growing up, and now you have these companies that are taking the best parts of craft distilling, but even scaling them up into an industrial production. It's one of the reasons why we at Three Chord are like really happy to be working with companies like Bardstown Bourbon Company,
Yeah,
Wilderness Trail, Jackson
great
Purchase.
distilleries. Mm-hmm.
Great distilleries. I don't know if you've heard of Jackson Purchase.
I think you're on mute, Ari.
Oh, sorry.
There you go. Hear you now.
Perfect. Sorry about that. I apologize.
It's all right.
Jackson Purchase is a new production distillery in Kentucky that has the same still as Stitzel Weller, 100% copper, and we're elated that we're going to make a couple hundred barrels there next month. Once in amazing team, Terry Ballard's there from Willett, Stephen Beam. You know, they got a Beam to run the stills.
Yeah.
And so there are so many distilleries that are coming online right now that are using the best practices from the past, 2 decades and scaling it up on an industrial level. And what that means is that 3, 4, 5 years from now, us whiskey fans are going to have a lot of really fun components to be unique single barrels and then really interesting blending components. So this latest blend, this 50% Tennessee, 25% Kentucky, 25% Indiana. What are your thoughts on this one?
What do you think, Eric?
I'm making another one right now. I do really like it. I'm trying to decide if I like it more than the last one.
I'm making another of the last one. I think, honestly, I think we're to the point where we can probably pick between the two. This is the first one, I guess, for me that really borders that Tennessee flavor profile where it's really starting to have that overwhelming propensity in the blend, I guess. And so the question becomes is, because it is a great barrel on its own too, though it has rough edges, it's, do you want that barrel with a little bit of the things from the other 2 barrels, or do you want more of a, or do you want to showcase a little more of what the other barrels bring into the picture? And I think that's that's the question, because I think they're both really good. I think it's just a question of what's the preference. And then as far as, because we'll decide on the finishing too, what finishing, and I assume it would be the same with either, because I think they both kind of lean the same way regardless of where they go. Would you be with the toasted oak finishing? I think that's probably what you had suggested, Ari, on that. Or
yeah, I mean, I think to go a specialty cask finish, to be able to see how this could change in a seasoning cask would be really interesting. In what we're deciding between the 40% Tennessee, 30% Kentucky, 30% Indiana, or the 50%, 25-25. This is, I'm not going to say it's like splitting hairs. My suggestion would be to start with Tennessee 50%, Kentucky 25, Indiana 25. And then one of the things we can do, and again, not to overcomplicate it, but as we taste that, it's going to be easier to dose in. What we can do is put essentially some of that Kentucky and some of that Indiana on the side. And if it makes sense to dose it in a little bit as we continue to taste every 2 weeks or so, this blend that's been put into a barrel, we can bring the Tennessee from 50% down to 40%. We can kind of take the last blend and turn it into the previous blend that came right before it. But we have the components on hand to do that. But it would be harder to go the other way. So I think we max out the blend in terms of the Tennessee, because again, that's the component that we have the smallest volume of. And then if we want to add more Kentucky and Indiana as it goes on, then that remains an option. And that's sort of where cask management and blending come together. They're really hand in glove. So that would be my strong recommendation. And if you like, I'm happy to, what I would do is essentially email the group that protocol. We're going to add this many gallons of Tennessee, this many gallons of Kentucky, this many gallons of Indiana. And as we taste it, if we want to add a little bit more Kentucky or Indiana into the blend to move it slightly in a direction, we have that ability.
So basically, so just to summarize that, so blend goes in, it's a 50% Tennessee, 25% Kentucky, 25% Indiana. Let's just say in this example, it loses it loses volume inside of the finishing barrel. What we do is we top that off with, now at this point, a 50-50 Indiana Kentucky mix, essentially, because we're never going to get back to the previous. We're just not going to lose that much volume that quickly, so we don't have to worry about that. But what we're going to do is we're going to offset the impact of the finishing to some extent, bringing it closer to what it tastes like right now, and also kind of split the difference between these two barrels. It's obviously, more work involved in doing that, but it gives us a little bit of control over that idea that if we say, look, it's the finishing is a little too powerful, or the Tennessee component still feels a little too powerful, we can kind of pull it back a little bit as we go.
That's right. And that's part of active cask management. It's tasting your barrel at regular increments. Like, so when we put a barrel like this together, we'll actually put alerts on our phone, on our calendar, where on this date, we get in and your phone beeps at you and it means pull a sample from this barrel, get it in the mail. You would both have some of the 50-50 Kentucky Indiana blend. So you could play around by adding a couple drops into it and say, hey, I think it makes sense to add 3% more of this into it because it's being pulled in a direction. And to be honest, I think that sort of interaction, that's whiskey making, right? That's what we hope to give some people the experience of doing it, to see how these products kind of change over time and how you can react to it. And then when it's time to take it out of the barrel,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say tasting this, I mean, for me, Eric, I'd be splitting hairs between these last two. I like them both. Certainly, going higher on Tennessee puts more. It makes that more of the star of the show. But I don't think it's a dramatic difference from one to the next. What do you think?
I'm coming around to the last one, the higher, the higher Tennessee.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. It's just a really tasty blend. I mean, that's what it comes down to. It tastes good.
It's when you get to blend these components from different states of different ages, different mash bills, different cooperages.
I mean,
now, even with three components, it can be incredibly a complex exercise, right? Even just with three components.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I think that one nails it.
Yeah. What's that?
I think that one nails it.
Yeah.
I like 50, 25, 25.
Yep.
And then if to have the option of dosing in a little bit more Kentucky or Tennessee, if we feel like it's needed, that seems to me the right play here.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're thinking the toasted oak for the finishing barrel as compared with the hybrid, or thinking hybrid compared to toasted oak?
I think toasted oak. Is where this wants to live. I think the hybrid would provide tannin and almost a little bit of bitterness and structure, which already exists because the Tennessee has it.
With its 16 and a half years, it's got that oakiness to it. It's got the bitterness to it already. We don't want to increase that.
If it were a younger whiskey, if it were the Indiana tempered with a little bit of Tennessee, I would probably more strongly recommend a hybrid barrel because it's going to add some of those components that we're already getting from the Tennessee.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of have that. But I think that sort of ethereal character of a toasted oak, that really cool kind of silky toffee, is going to add a layer to this where I can almost imagine, sweet and bitter, how those two work together in food. I think that's the direction that this would go in. And they highlight those characteristics, highlight each other really well. They play off each other really well.
Yeah. That's it. I think we're there.
Okay. Put it on the board.
and then the whiskey gods, have their say as well. And because this is not necessarily a project that humans have total control over. Equilibrium is found in the barrel, and things change, and that's part of the really interesting part of it. But I'm going ahead and locking in Tennessee 50%, Kentucky 25%, Indiana 25%, finished in a toasted barrel, and getting folks samples on the regular. And I think this is going to be a really, really interesting, really cool barrel.
Yeah, I agree. I think too, it's a strong enough whiskey to start with that is going to hold up to finishing and give a little more leeway in terms of how quickly it maybe changes. It's definitely it's a whiskey that grabs you. It's still a whiskey that grabs you. It's not this is not a shy whiskey by any means.
Well, cheers.
That's great.
All right.
Well, hey, Ari,
Enjoy it.
this was great. We got, I think there's a handful of people that stuck with us, the whole time watching through this. So appreciate that, guys.
Hope you learned something, right?
Yeah. Whenever we do these, I feel like there's just new information. Everybody, there's always something to add. There's always interesting info. I mean, Ari, you brought up a lot of things that frankly, no one's necessarily talked about before, either because it didn't come up or because it's not top of mind. And that's what's fantastic about, these kind of exercises is getting that information out there. And look, if I can sit and say, I learned a ton in what ended up being a 2-hour thing, which is a long time, but that's fantastic, man. I appreciate you taking the time to do this with us. I'm super excited about this one.
I really appreciate your time as well. Hanging out has been a lot of fun, and I look forward to revisiting this barrel with you over the next couple of weeks or months.
For sure. Hey, so everybody watching, this will be available to the Breaking Bourbon Single Barrel Club. If you're not part of the club, check us out on Patreon, patreon.com/Breaking Bourbon. It will also be available to the Bourbonr Pro through Seelbach. So this is going to run through Seelbach, the online retailer that we work with as one of our handful of retailers that we partner with. And, we'll be doing a lot more of these experimental type things. So, keep tuning in. We appreciate you guys watching, commenting. Eric, anything else to add before we?
No, I just like to thank Ari and Ryan and, anybody else that's involved down at Three Chord. Thanks a lot for doing all this. It's a lot of hands-on work, but it's going to really be a great end product here. That's really unique and, something we got to create together. It's a great experience.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys so much for your time, and thank Ryan for Ryan is, if you don't know Ryan Gill, he's a whiskey professional on the rise who is bringing people together all over the place. So this is really great. I really appreciate your time.
Great. Well, with that, cheers, guys, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Ari.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.